Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. The rural roads of Arkansas were hot and humid that summer. Night. A pale moon hung in the sky and the stars shone silently. Terry Wallace had spent time with a few friends in a small town and decided to go for one last night drive to shake off the fatigue of the day. As he got behind the wheel of his pickup truck, the sense of peace and youthful excitement was still reflected on his face. He was full of life. He was in his early 20s, had a family, and most of all, a little daughter whom he loved dearly. He had many plans for the future and dreamed of building a better life. However, that night, fate was about to draw a completely different path for him. As the clock passed midnight, Terry was driving along the narrow and winding roads. The trees lining both sides of the road stood like ghosts in the darkness. As he sped forward with his companion, the only sound breaking the silence was the faint hum of the tires against the asphalt. But a moment of distraction changed the entire night in a shocking instant, like a fracture in fate. As he turned the bend, the truck's tires began to skid. Terry quickly turned the steering wheel, but the pickup had already lost control. It first veered onto the loose gravel by the roadside, then started spinning out. Those few seconds felt like an eternity. A terrifying crash shattered the night's silence. The truck smashed into the metal guardrails and then flipped over, tumbling toward the edge of a cliff. Glass shattered, and metal screeched as it twisted and scraped against itself, producing a piercing sound. After the accident, everything suddenly fell silent. The truck had overturned, the engine had gone quiet, and only the whisper of the wind remained. Terry's passenger had lost his life on impact. Terry, however, lay motionless, covered in blood. His heart was still beating, but his consciousness had completely faded. When the first light of dawn hit the still glowing headlights, a passing driver noticed the wreckage and called the authorities. When ambulances arrived at the scene, paramedics raced against time to pull Terry out of the vehicle. Though his pulse was weak, he was still alive. He had severe injuries to his neck, head, and various parts of his body. He was quickly placed into an ambulance and rushed to the hospital with sirens blaring. The emergency room was unusually busy that night. When doctors assessed Terry's condition, they discovered he had suffered a traumatic brain injury and was completely unresponsive. A series of tests were conducted, and neurologists were urgently called in, but the result remained the same. Terry's brain had suffered severe damage. He was placed in intensive care and connected to a ventilator. His family, waiting in the hospital corridors, were filled with fear and anxiety as they awaited news from the doctors. Terry's mother refused to accept what had happened to her son. Her eyes remained fixed on the hospital doors, hoping for any sign of good news. But when the doctors finally approached them, their expressions were serious. Terry is in a deep coma. At that moment, time stood still for his family. The young man, once full of life, was now silent and motionless. No one knew if he would ever open his eyes again. His hospital room became a place where time almost ceased to exist. The steady beeping of the heart monitor, the rhythmic hum of the ventilator, and the muffled sounds from outside were the only signs of movement. Days passed by, each one identical to the last. Every morning, nurses checked Terry's condition, changed his IV fluids, and repositioned his body to prevent bed sores. But nothing changed. Terry remained unresponsive, showing no signs of waking. His mother and father arrived at the hospital, every morning with the same hope. They would sit by his bedside, his father gazing at Terry's motionless body with a deep sigh, while his mother gently held his hand and spoke to him about old memories. She would tell him stories from his childhood, hum his favorite songs, and cling to the hope that one day he would open his eyes. In the early weeks, family, friends, and townspeople visited often. Some stood silently by Terry's side as if offering condolences, while others tried to console his parents. But as time passed, the visits became less frequent. People returned to their own lives, struggling to cope with Terry's silence. Doctors performed regular checkups, but each time they gave the same explanation. There is no improvement in his brain function. Unfortunately, Terry's condition remains stable, but he is showing no signs of consciousness. Each passing day grew heavier for the family. Weeks turned into months, seasons changed, yet Terry's condition remained the same. The house that was once filled with laughter had now turned into a silent place of mourning. His mother would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and still go to check his room. But Terry's bed was empty. He was in the hospital, kept alive by machines. Doctors said that the chances of patients in prolonged comas waking up decreased over time. Some of them reminded the family of the hardest choice they might have to make, transferring Terry to a long-term care facility. This would mean moving him from the hospital to a nursing home and preparing for a slow farewell. However, Terry's mother fiercely opposed this idea. She believed her son could still hear them somewhere deep inside. Every day she whispered, "I'm here, Terry. I hear you and you hear us, don't you?" She hugged him, talked about things he loved, and made old jokes. She waited patiently, hoping that one day he would open his eyes. His father, though he never spoke of his despair, could not hide it from his eyes. Watching his son lie motionless in bed was a daily torment. He tried to hold on to his wife's hope, but deep down, he faced the harsh truth. Terry might never come back. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. People started to forget about Terry. But his parents never stopped sitting by his bedside every morning. No matter what, they still believed that one day, Terry would open his eyes. Terry's body was still breathing, but his mind was trapped in an endless darkness. For him, time had stopped. He had no awareness that days, months, and even years had passed. Everything he had known about his life had been cut short on that hot summer night in 1984, in that terrible accident. That night, he was young, healthy, and full of dreams. But now, for him, everything was just an uncertain void. In the outside world, however, time had not stopped. The hospital corridors remained busy as usual. New patients came in. Some recovered and left, while others remained forever. Terry remained, stuck in his silent world. As years passed, the doctors and nurses who had once known him were replaced. The new medical staff only knew about him from the cold clinical sentences in his file. Suffered a severe traumatic brain injury in 1984. Unconscious, no spontaneous movement. His family had changed too. His parents had grown old. The lines on their faces deepened. His once strong and active father now walked with a cane. His mother carried the weight of the years on her shoulders, yet she never stopped sitting by her son's bedside at every opportunity. Her hair had turned gray, but her love and hope for Terry never faded. However, not everyone was as patient as Terry's mother. His friends eventually stopped visiting. At first, they would sit by his bedside and talk, but over time, they believed that this silent waiting was meaningless and moved on with their lives. His name was now only a memory from the past. The biggest change, however, was in Terry's little daughter. When she was born, her father had dreamed of seeing her first steps and hearing her first words. But Terry never got to witness his daughter growing up. She had no memory of him. Over the years, she became a young woman. She went to school, graduated, and moved on with her life. She knew that her father had been in a coma for years, but she only knew him through the stories others told her. As time passed, Terry's name was mentioned less and less. Time was slowly pushing his existence into the shadows. The hope of bringing him back had long since faded for many. Even the doctors now saw his case as nothing more than a medical anomaly. But he was still there, in a hospital room, silent, motionless, breathing, and waiting. Somewhere deep in his consciousness, perhaps he was still trapped in the lost time. It was an ordinary morning in 2003. Nurses hurried down the hospital corridors, doctors reviewed patient files, and life outside continued as usual. But in Terry Wallace's room, the same silence that had lasted for years remained. Terry had been lying there for exactly 19 years. For the nurses who monitored him, his room had become just another routine stop. They checked his pulse, monitored his muscle spasms, and changed his position to prevent bed sores. Beyond these tasks, there was no expectation from him. No one expected a response. He had been the same for years, silent, unresponsive, and lost in time. But that morning, one of the nurses on duty noticed something different on Terry's face. At first she thought it was just an illusion caused by exhaustion, but as she looked more closely, she realized she wasn't mistaken. Terry's eyelids were faintly twitching. The nurse held her breath and watched for a few seconds. Maybe it was a reflexive movement. Sometimes patients in comas experience involuntary muscle twitches, but then something else happened. Terry's lips moved slightly. It seemed like he was trying to make a sound. This was no ordinary reflex. Something was changing. The nurse immediately notified the doctors and called Terry's family. Within minutes, his mother and father arrived at the hospital. Although they had been trying to accept the fact that their son had been unconscious for so many years, they had always carried a small hope deep inside. But this time, they felt that something was different. His mother hurried to her son's bedside, her eyes filled with tears. She gently held his hand and whispered the words she had been saying for years. "Son, we're here." And then, a miracle happened. Terry's eyelids twitched again. Slowly, after all these years, his eyes opened. The room, for a moment, felt like a place where time had stopped. Everyone held their breath, watching him. Then, a hoarse and strained voice broke the silence. "Mom." One word, just one word. But it was like a cry that shattered the 19 years of silence. His mother looked at him, tears streaming down her face. She held his hands tightly, saying, "I'm here, son. We're here." Her voice trembling. The doctors were stunned, and the nurses exchanged astonished looks. The man who had been unchanged for all these years had suddenly come back. After that moment, a mix of shock and joy spread across everyone's faces in the room. Terry's voice was weak, his words unclear, but the only thing that mattered at that moment was this. Terry was not completely lost anymore. The first spark had ignited. Doctors, nurses, and Terry's family watched him closely, holding their breath with every movement he made. The man who had given no response for years now had his eyes open, and he had spoken. This was nearly impossible from a medical standpoint, and first, the doctors were skeptical about whether Terry's consciousness had truly returned. But as days went by, they noticed that he was saying more words. At first, he only responded to his mother's voice, muttering a few words. But soon, he began turning his head when his name was called. Over time, he started talking about things from his past, but there was a problem. Terry's mind was still stuck in 1984. Every sentence he spoke was about his life before the accident. He asked his father if the truck had been repaired. He told his mother he was going to meet his friends that night. His family didn't know how to respond. For him, the past 19 years didn't exist. When he saw his father, he furrowed his brow and looked at him for a long time. "Why did your hair turn white?" he asked. When he noticed the wrinkles on his mother's face, his confusion deepened. For him, time had stopped, but the outside world had changed. The biggest shock came when he learned that his daughter was now an adult. The little baby he remembered was now a young woman. When she came to his side, he looked at her carefully, searching for a familiar expression in her eyes, but he couldn't recognize her. "Who is this?" he asked, astonished. His family slowly tried to explain the truth to him. "Terry, you've been in a coma for many years. You had an accident in 1984. You've been here since then." But for him, it was a hard reality to accept. "What do you mean?" "I just got in that truck yesterday," he replied. His mind had been stuck in a void for years, and now suddenly it had jumped 19 years forward. Terry's return was a miracle, but it was also a great trauma for him. Looking back, he realized that he had lost a significant part of his life. Once a young and healthy man, now he struggled to move, and he had to relearn how to speak. His family was ready to support him in every way. He started physical therapy to regain the ability to walk and strengthen his muscles. He underwent speech therapy to improve his ability to talk, but the hardest part was accepting the years he had lost. For him, the world had stayed frozen where he had closed his eyes. But now, when he woke up, everything was vastly different. The day Terry Wallace opened his eyes was a miracle for his family. However, this miracle didn't mean that he could simply pick up where he had left off in his old life. His body, which had been immobile for 19 years, had weakened, and his muscles had lost most of their function. Even the simplest movements required a long and arduous rehabilitation process. In the first few weeks, Terry's physical and mental state was quite fragile. When he tried to stand, his legs couldn't support him. When he tried to speak, words were difficult to form. Simple everyday actions like lifting his hands or holding a spoon became possible only with great effort. Doctors and therapists began an intensive physical therapy program to help him regain movement. But for Terry, the hardest obstacle wasn't the physical limitations. It was the chasm created by the passage of time. He still thought it was 1984, and he wanted to return to his old life. But the world outside had changed. His old friends had become very different people. Some had married, others had moved away. His family had aged, and many of the people he had known in his youth had passed away. His own life had stood still, continuing only in a hospital room. One of the biggest shocks was adjusting to his now adult daughter. He remembered her as a baby, but now she was a young woman, more articulate and free-moving than he had ever known her. As a father, missing her childhood left a deep emptiness inside him, but his family's love and support kept him strong with each step. As days passed, Terry began to make small but significant progress. He started speaking a few more words with greater ease. Then, even with assistance, he was able to take a few steps. As he became more adept at using his hands, he relearned how to hold a fork and knife. Therapists celebrated every success, and his family encouraged him at every moment. Terry's awakening was a major event in the medical world. A person who had been in a coma for 19 years regaining consciousness was an extraordinarily rare occurrence. As doctors researched his case, the news quickly spread to the media. His story became an inspiring symbol, not only for his family but for many people who had lost hope. Terry knew he could never return to his old life, but he was determined to make the best of the new life he had. For him, every new word, every new step was a symbol of holding on to life. In the end, something that once seemed impossible had come to pass. Terry had returned to life after losing 19 years.